I want to talk about Sonic, of all things. Not something I typically cover on the channel, but I am a fan of the series. I've been around since the 90s. I obviously played those classic games, and they're, well, close to my heart. I wanted to talk, though, about replayability, and there are a couple things that I think affect this, so we're going to go ahead and get into that here. Hi, I'm Skybird, by the way, if you've never watched this channel. I apologize for the video. I look like a ghost right now. That's because I'm using OBS, and it's not always great. It does a lot of stupid things. Anyway, if you enjoy this content, be sure to subscribe. It really helps out the channel tremendously. And let's talk about what you see on screen here, because we're talking about branching paths. What are branching paths? I think it's fairly straightforward, and if you are a fan of the classic Sonic series, or really Sonic in general, you probably already know what these colors here represent. But ultimately, in terms of this game, the idea would be that Eggman, in and of himself, takes or kidnaps, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, so Sonic has to find his way through to free them. So he follows his own linear path. Somewhere along the way, he is able to unlock Tails, whether it be in the middle of his linear progression, his storyline, his campaign, whatever, or at the very end. It doesn't terribly much matter here. It's all concepts, right? But once Tails is freed, you suddenly recall these signs you've been seeing kind of all over the place, right? Somewhere in Act 1, you remember seeing a picture maybe of Tails that told you, hey, you could take a different path here. You could go somewhere else. So you choose to go back to Zone 1, Act 1 with Sonic, but now paired with Tails, because this game would have a partnering system similar in some ways to Sonic 3 Advance. But in this case, when you have Tails either as your main character or as your partner, you now are afforded the ability with your main character to fly. And with that flight, you're able to access a brand new path. So, doesn't mean you're obligated to take it, but assuming you take that path with Tails as your main or partner, you are now able to unlock Knuckles somewhere along this campaign. Again, middle end doesn't matter terribly much. Now that you have Knuckles along, once again, you recall those images you were seeing long before, and you go ahead and you take Knuckles through his own route here. And Knuckles, in this case, again, as your partner, as your main character, is able to at some point unlock Amy. Amy, again, has her own paths. It doesn't need to look directly like this. Some paths could even cross over, or whatever the case may be. But you will notice by the end here, we are led down a family tree, if you will, where you come across many different final outcomes. You get to the final level. Now, one of the other issues that I think plague a lot of Sonic games, both 2D and 3D, both classic and modern, are boss fights. There are basically three types of boss fights in Sonic. The waiting game, which I'm just not going to even talk about in this video, but also two others, which I tend to call arena boss fights and circuit boss fights. What are the differences here? Arena boss fights are boss fights that basically halt the progress of the game. They stop your character dead in their tracks. You're not allowed to progress forward until you defeat that boss. This is most bosses from classic Sonic, from Sonic 1 through Sonic 3. Not all, but most. However, arena type bosses are not the only type, because you also have what I'm calling circuit bosses, which are basically bosses that you run after or run away from. These are racing type bosses, like from Sonic CD, or even like Sonic 1 Labyrinth Zone, where you're trying to chase the boss to the very top. But these can also be bosses like those you've seen in Sonic Advance 2, where every boss in that game is a boss that you race against, that you run against and try to defeat, right? So it keeps you constantly moving. Many of the classic games, many of course, those modern games, all utilize this type of fight as well. So what if we had a game that had both? Here's my proposition. Here's what I think really makes this game quite unique. The interaction of these storylines with the final boss. What if the final boss is, for all intents and purposes, a Voltron, a combination build of all of the bosses you fought previously? You could probably recognize them. Have you seen them in those previous levels? You see these little flyer copters when you're playing as Tails, or you see these little arms hovering as a boss in Zone 1 when you're playing as Sonic, because, oh yeah, Sonic and Tails, their Act 2 is completely different for their Zone 1 or their Zone 2 and Zone 3, etc., right? And so their boss is different as well, geared specifically towards fighting that character, in much the same way as how Sonic and Knuckles, or Sonic 3 and Knuckles rather, would have bosses that were slightly different depending on which character you were playing as. When you played as Sonic and Tails, you fought the same characters. When you played as Knuckles, though, you fought different variants of specific bosses. And so in this case here, the idea is that at the end of these levels, you're fighting basically arena type bosses. You're stopped, yes, but you defeat these bosses, you make it to the end of the game. In the final zone, you're cut off with this little, cutscene or whatever, right? You're trapped in a little cage or whatever. Eggman standing at this big elaborate computer or whatever, presses some buttons, laughs at you, and then suddenly the focus shifts and you see all of these acts you've previously been to where the boss you've defeated, still surrounded by the shrapnel of the defeated, destroyed robot that you beat before, quakes suddenly, it awakens, it lifts off the ground, it flies away, and then it goes back to the screen with Sonic and Eggman on it. Eggman runs off the screen, Sonic is freed from this cage, whatever, right? To chase Eggman, sure, or there are these vortexes that appear. And I don't know the specific reason for why this is the case, whether it's Sonic having a hold of the Phantom Ruby or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Add MacGuffin here. But ultimately, these little vortexes open up, and there are 7 of them in total, or how many ever total zones there are in the game. The idea being that you can choose and pick to go through any one of or all of these 7 vortexes. When you do, you are brought to a sort of facsimile of the zones you've been to already through your timeline, if you will, right? So Sonic will go back to like zone 1, but it's its own unique zone, and it's short. It's not a full zone, but maybe like 15-second snippet where now you're running against the boss. And the idea is that in this vortex, in this alternate dimension, let's call it, right, you are now fighting the boss. But if you don't defeat it, let's say in 15 seconds, right, then you get kicked back out of this dimension and you lose that dimension. It doesn't matter. It doesn't ultimately change anything. Like, you don't die, but that gate is closed off to you. So you're no longer able to go back through that vortex and try again. However, if you defeat the boss in this little alternate dimension, in this facsimile, right, then it doesn't make it to the final boss you're going to fight. So if in zone 1 you're fighting against the arms, whether they be flying arms when you're playing as Tails, or they be, you know, driller arms if you're playing as Sonic, whatever, right, then ultimately they don't make it to the final boss, so the final boss doesn't have those arms. If you fight the jetpack, it doesn't have the jetpack, and this affects how the final boss plays as well. So if the boss doesn't have the jetpack, he can't use the moves that require the jetpack, right? He can't fly off the screen to try and fall back down on you. If he doesn't have his legs, he can't stomp on you properly. If he doesn't have his head, maybe he can't track your character with like heat-seeking projectiles of some kind. If he doesn't have the arms, again, he can't like grab your character or whatever. And because each of the characters fight slightly different versions of these bosses as well, the final boss is not just a combination of each of the previous bosses, but it's specifically the variant of the boss you previously fought. So if you're playing on Tails' timeline or whatever, right, his campaign, then Tails is fighting mostly flying-based bosses, right? Because those are the things I think Tails would struggle against the most. That's at least the idea, that these are bosses that they'd struggle against, right? And so if you're playing with Tails as your main or partner character, then the bosses you fight, not only do they appear at the end of these zones, but they appear on the final boss as well, meaning you're facing not only the final boss, but all of these independent parts that have the ability to fly, like Tails can fly and can do all kinds of things based on that, meaning that the final boss isn't just arms and head and feet and hips or whatever and jetpack, but it's specifically Tails' variant of those things. So the final boss is essentially flavored slightly differently. It's identifiable. All the parts look the same or look similar. They're instantly identifiable, but they play slightly different depending on which character team up you have. So Amy's version is unique to Amy, Knuckles' version is unique to Knuckles, and so on and so forth. So all of these different bosses, although similar looking at the end, are different from each other. And I really like this concept because not only does it mean that all of the characters fight slightly different bosses depending on which campaign you take. And remember, I said you're not obligated to take Tails' path just because Tails is your partner, right? If you play as Tails and Knuckles, you could play Sonic's campaign all the way through and fight the same boss Sonic fought, but you could just as easily take the campaign down Knuckles' route and then fight with Knuckles' lower route version, right? And so it just plays, essentially you get to build your own final boss. Does that make sense? Like, I love this as a concept. Maybe I'm overselling it here. I don't know. You'll also notice, though, we get these off the screen for a moment, that each of the zones are different depending on the line you go down, right? The branch you're on. So Zone 1, while it's probably the same or very similar between all characters, though the Act 2 Zone 1 is different for those characters, right? Depending on who you play and who your partner is. By the time you get to Zone 2, they're on completely different paths. The paths have diverged, right? So now, Zone 2 for Sonic might be, a chemical plant adjacent zone or a spring yard adjacent zone, whatever. It doesn't have to be a repeat of those, just using those for context. While Zone 2 for Tails could be Power Grid Canyon or some completely unique zone. And ultimately, as the game continues to get further and further along, you see that more zones start to develop depending on which path you take, meaning that the game ends up being a lot more replayable because not only are the facsimiles of each of these zones different, right? You go to these alternate dimensions, but it's the dimensions based on the zones you previously played. So there aren't just 7 alternate dimensions. By the time you get to the end of the game, I don't want to do the math here, but that's a lot of possible iterations, I guess. There's a better word for that. I can't think of it right now. But ultimately, it means that your experience in racing those bosses is different. The boss you're versing in those races is different. The atmosphere you're surrounded by, right? The setting you're in. Because it's also worth noting, too, that they don't have to be the exact same, right? If you go into Vortex Zone 1, it doesn't mean it needs to be a literal copy of Zone 1, but it could just be based on the objects that you saw in that zone, right? It could be nighttime, it could be corrupt, it could be whatever. There could be other things that have sort of bled their way into it, whatever the case may be. Maybe it's already been taken over by Eggman, so now there's all these other machines and things that are in there too. And ultimately, you're trying to dodge obstacles and catch up to the boss. The boss can fight back, can retaliate against you, but ultimately it's trying to run away from you, right? I love this as a concept. It's just a concept, but I think it's a really good one, and ultimately it helps to lend a lot of replayability to a game like this. And then the idea ultimately is that at the end of the day, you'd be able to maybe select levels after a certain point. If you beat the game with like every character, maybe you can select levels from there, whatever the case may be, so that you can still play through any zone as any character. But when you're fighting through campaigns specifically, you're locked to specific characters. Does that make sense? Like this path up here requires essentially Amy and Knuckles, right? Because you have to get to Knuckles' path first. You'd have to technically get to Tails' path, which I don't think that's technically possible, but you get the point I'm getting at, right? So ultimately, I think there's a really interesting concept. And then in terms of how the characters get to where they get to, Sonic is sort of the speed character. He'd be the fastest of these, meaning that when he's rolled up into a ball, you know, when you go down a slope, you also go up a slope in Sonic games. And so maybe he can go just up the slope a little bit further because he's got more momentum. And because he's in his ball form, then he is able to break through some kind of barrier that other characters can't, right? Because if Knuckles can't get up there when he's rolled up into a ball, he'd have to climb up there. But since he's not in a ball anymore, he wouldn't be able to. Hopefully you get the idea I'm getting at. And then Knuckles can burrow underground in specific areas, so maybe he could break his way into like a little S-curve or whatever that takes him to a different area. Tails obviously can fly, so he can reach paths that other characters can't reach because of that flight. And then, of course, Amy has a hammer. She could flip like switches or something like that in specific levels, whatever the case may be. I think that this is a really phenomenal idea, but it's just an idea. I, of course, want to know your thoughts, and I specifically want to know your thoughts on boss fights in Sonic games, because, as I mentioned, there are many different ways to fight bosses in Sonic games, both in fan games as well as from the Sonic team themselves. A lot of bosses, like in Superstars, are kind of just a waiting game, so they're not really my thing, but maybe that's something you quite enjoy, the breather in between each time you have the ability to hit a boss. So ultimately, let me know your thoughts. Do you think that 2D games or 3D games do it better, or are there any specific games that you like, or are there just specific bosses that really speak to you? Also, if you want to take the conversation further, check out the Discord link in the description. Once again, check out the Instagram and Patreon link down there as well if you want to help support the channel. Greatly appreciate that. And of course, as always, be sure to subscribe. Helps out the channel tremendously. I'll see y'all in the next one. Take care.